Captain James Whitmore stood at attention in the grand corridor of Buckingham Palace, his red uniform pressed to perfection, his tall black hat casting a shadow over his weathered face. 23 years he had served the crown, through 3 monarchs and countless ceremonies. His record was spotless, his loyalty unquestioned, until this morning when everything changed. The palace buzzed with unusual energy. Staff members whispered in corners, their voices carrying hints of excitement and concern. Today was the day Queen Camilla would officially receive her new ceremonial title, an honor that would place her among the most distinguished figures in royal history. The ceremony had been planned for months, with dignitaries from across the Commonwealth flying in to witness the historic moment. James had received his orders 3 days prior. As captain of the Royal Guard's ceremonial unit, he would lead the procession and formally present the new title to Her Majesty. It should have been the crowning moment of his career, a privilege reserved for only the most trusted officers. Instead, it felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in. The trouble had started 6 months ago when James discovered documents in the palace archives that raised serious questions about the legitimacy of the proposed title. Hidden among centuries-old papers, he found evidence suggesting that the title had been stripped from the crown's authority during a little-known parliamentary dispute in 1847. According to these documents, only Parliament could restore such honors, not the monarch alone. James had tried to raise his concerns through proper channels. He approached his superior, Colonel Richardson, with the evidence. Richardson, a man more concerned with politics than protocol, dismissed the findings immediately. "Captain Whitmore," Richardson had said, barely glancing at the papers, "your job is to follow orders, not to play historian. The ceremony will proceed as planned." When James persisted, suggesting they at least consult the royal historians, Richardson's tone became threatening. "I would hate to see a distinguished career end over something so trivial. Perhaps you should focus on your duties and leave constitutional matters to your betters." The warning was clear, but James couldn't let it go. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown, and that included protecting it from constitutional violations, even if those violations came from within. Over the following weeks, he quietly researched further, consulting with retired palace historians and legal experts who confirmed his fears. The title, as currently planned, would indeed be illegitimate. His research led him to Dr. Margaret Ashworth, a constitutional law professor at Cambridge who had spent decades studying royal prerogatives. When James presented her with photocopies of the documents, her face grew grave. "Captain Whitmore," she said, adjusting her glasses as she studied the papers, "if these are authentic, and I believe they are, then you're absolutely correct. This ceremony cannot proceed legally. The Crown lost the authority to grant this particular title over 170 years ago." "What would happen if it proceeds anyway?" James asked. Dr. Ashworth shook her head. "It would create a constitutional crisis. Parliament would have to intervene, and the title would eventually be declared void. But the damage to the monarchy's credibility would be severe. People trust that the crown operates within the law." That night, James lay awake staring at the ceiling of his modest flat near the palace. His wife, Sarah, had noticed his troubled mood, but knew better than to pry into palace business. Their 2 children slept peacefully in the next room, unaware that their father faced the most difficult decision of his life. James thought about his grandfather, who had served in the Royal Guard during World War II. The old man had always told him that duty meant doing what was right, even when it was difficult. "The crown isn't just about the people wearing it, lad," his grandfather had said. "It's about the institution, the law, the promise we make to the people. Protect that, and you protect everything." The next morning brought a flurry of final preparations. The throne room was decorated with flowers from the royal gardens, and the finest china was brought out for the reception afterward. James watched the activity with growing dread, knowing he had to act, but uncertain how. His opportunity came during the final briefing. All the key personnel involved in the ceremony gathered in the palace's blue drawing room. Colonel Richardson outlined the schedule once more, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioning obedience. "The ceremony begins at 11 sharp," Richardson announced. "Captain Whitmore, you will lead Her Majesty to the throne, where she will receive the title. The presentation speech has been prepared and approved. Are there any questions?" James felt every eye in the room turn to him as he slowly raised his hand. His heart pounded so hard he was sure others could hear it. "Sir, I must raise a concern about the legal basis for this ceremony." The room fell silent. Richardson's face darkened, but James continued before he could be silenced. "I have discovered evidence that suggests the Crown no longer possesses the authority to grant this particular title. The documents date back to 1847 and indicate that Parliament assumed exclusive control over such honors following a constitutional dispute." Several staff members began murmuring among themselves. Richardson slammed his hand on the table. "Captain Whitmore, you are out of line. We've discussed this matter and it's been resolved." "With respect, sir, it hasn't been properly investigated. I have consulted with constitutional experts who confirmed that proceeding with this ceremony would violate established law." Richardson stood, his face red with anger. "Captain, you are relieved of duty. Report to my office immediately after this meeting." But James remained standing. "Sir, my oath is to the Crown and to the law. I cannot in good conscience participate in a ceremony that undermines both." The room erupted in whispered conversations. Some staff members looked shocked, others sympathetic. James noticed that Mrs. Pemberton, the Queen's private secretary, was taking careful notes. She had always been known for her meticulous attention to legal details. "Guard!" Richardson shouted. "Escort Captain Whitmore from the premises." Two junior guards stepped forward reluctantly. They had served under James for years and respected him deeply. One of them, Sergeant Davies, looked torn between duty and loyalty. "Sir," Davies said to Richardson, "perhaps we should hear the captain's evidence before taking action." Richardson's eyes blazed. "Sergeant, follow your orders or join him in unemployment." As the guards moved to escort him out, James pulled out a folder containing photocopies of the historical documents. "I'm leaving this evidence for anyone who wants to examine it. The truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient." Mrs. Pemberton quickly reached for the folder. "I'll ensure these documents are properly reviewed," she said firmly. Richardson tried to object, but Mrs. Pemberton had authority that even he couldn't challenge. As the Queen's private secretary, she answered directly to Her Majesty on matters of protocol and law. James was escorted to Richardson's office, where he waited for 2 hours. During that time, he could hear urgent phone calls and hurried footsteps in the corridor outside. Something was happening, and he suspected his documents were causing quite a stir. Finally, Richardson entered, looking haggard. Behind him came Sir Thomas Blackwood, the palace's chief legal advisor, a man whose opinion carried enormous weight in constitutional matters. "Captain Whitmore," Sir Thomas began, his voice carefully neutral, "I've reviewed your documentation. Where exactly did you find these papers?" James explained his discovery in the archives, providing specific details about the location and condition of the documents. Sir Thomas listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification. "I've conducted preliminary research," Sir Thomas continued, "and your findings appear to have merit. The 1847 Parliamentary Act you referenced is indeed authentic, and it does seem to have transferred authority over this particular class of honors from the Crown to Parliament." Richardson looked stunned. "But the ceremony is scheduled to begin in 3 hours. Hundreds of guests have already arrived." Sir Thomas nodded gravely. "Which is why this situation is so serious. We cannot proceed with a legally questionable ceremony. But canceling at this point would create a diplomatic incident. What about quietly proceeding and sorting out the legal issues afterward? Richardson suggested. Both Sir Thomas and James spoke simultaneously. Absolutely not, Sir Thomas continued. Captain Whitmore is correct. Our duty is to protect the Crown from constitutional violations, not to compound them for the sake of convenience. Richardson sank into his chair. This will be a disaster. The Queen will be furious. The press will have a field day. The Queen, said a new voice from the doorway, is already aware of the situation. Everyone turned to see Mrs. Pemberton entering the room. Her usually calm demeanor showed signs of stress, but her voice remained steady. I've briefed Her Majesty on Captain Whitmore's findings, she continued. She has asked to speak with him personally before any decisions are made. James felt his knees go weak. In 23 years of service, he had never had a private audience with the monarch. The closest he had come was standing guard while she passed by. She wants to see me? He asked. Immediately, Mrs. Pemberton replied. Sir Thomas, she's requested that you accompany Captain Whitmore and bring all relevant documentation. As they walked through the palace corridors toward the Queen's private study, James couldn't help but notice the controlled chaos around them. Staff members were clearly on edge, and he caught glimpses of important-looking officials having intense, quiet conversations. The study was smaller and more personal than James had expected. Queen Camilla sat behind an elegant desk, still wearing her mourning dress rather than ceremonial robes. She looked up as they entered, her expression unreadable. Captain Whitmore, she said, her voice carrying both authority and curiosity. I understand you have concerns about today's ceremony. James stood at rigid attention. Your Majesty, I have discovered evidence that the ceremony as planned may not be legally valid. Please, sit down, the Queen said, gesturing to chairs arranged in front of her desk. I want to understand exactly what you've found. For the next hour, James presented his research in detail. The Queen listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated her own deep understanding of constitutional law. Sir Thomas provided additional context, confirming the legitimacy of James's concerns. When James finished, the Queen sat back in her chair, silent for several long moments. Finally, she spoke. Captain Whitmore, you realize that your actions today have put both of us in an extremely difficult position. James felt his heart sink. Your Majesty, I apologize if I have overstepped, but I felt I had no choice. The Queen held up her hand. I'm not criticizing you, Captain. I'm stating a fact. You forced us to confront a truth that would have been much easier to ignore. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens where guests were already gathering for the reception. 20 years ago, I might have chosen to proceed anyway, to avoid embarrassment and complications. But I've learned that the monarchy's strength comes from its adherence to law and tradition, not from shortcuts and conveniences. Turning back to face them, the Queen's expression was resolute. Sir Thomas, what would be required to make this ceremony legally sound? Parliamentary approval, Your Majesty. A simple vote would suffice, but it would take time. The Queen nodded. Then we postpone until we can do this properly. Captain Whitmore, your actions today have demonstrated exactly the kind of loyalty the Crown needs. You protected the institution even when it was difficult to do so. James felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Your Majesty, what about Colonel Richardson? He was not pleased with my actions. The Queen's expression hardened slightly. Colonel Richardson forgot that his first duty is to the Crown and the law, not to avoiding inconvenience. You reminded him of that, and you reminded me as well. As they prepared to leave, the Queen added, Captain, I want you to personally oversee the security arrangements for the rescheduled ceremony once Parliament grants approval. Your attention to detail and commitment to doing things properly will be essential. Walking back through the palace, James felt as though he were in a dream. His career, which he had thought was over just hours before, was not only intact, but had been explicitly endorsed by the Queen herself. The announcement of the postponement created exactly the chaos Richardson had predicted. The press demanded explanations, diplomatic guests were confused and sometimes offended, and palace staff worked frantically to manage the fallout. But James noticed something else in the days that followed. His fellow guards looked at him differently, with a new kind of respect. They had seen him risk everything to uphold the principles they all swore to protect, and they knew that the same courage would be there when they needed it. Word of his actions spread quietly through the palace community. Staff members who had worked there for decades began approaching him with their own concerns about various practices, knowing they had found someone who would listen and act when necessary. Mrs. Pemberton pulled him aside one afternoon. "Captain, you should know that your actions have initiated a broader review of palace procedures. The Queen has ordered a complete audit to ensure we're not operating under any other questionable authorities." "Has Parliament responded to the request?" James asked. "They're fast-tracking it. The Speaker was quite impressed that the Crown proactively identified and reported the issue rather than trying to cover it up. It actually strengthens the monarchy's position considerably." 3 weeks later, Parliament unanimously approved the restoration of the Crown's authority to grant the title, specifically recognizing Queen Camilla's worthiness to receive it. The ceremony was rescheduled, and this time it proceeded without a shadow of doubt about its legitimacy. James stood at his post during the rescheduled ceremony, watching as the Queen received her title with full legal authority behind it. The extra time had allowed for even more elaborate preparations, and the event was widely praised as one of the most magnificent royal ceremonies in recent memory. After the ceremony, as James prepared to leave for the evening, he found a handwritten note waiting for him. It was from the Queen herself, thanking him again for his courage and integrity. The final line read, "You reminded me that protecting the Crown sometimes means protecting it from itself." That night, James went home to his family with a clear conscience and a renewed sense of purpose. He had proven that doing the right thing, even when difficult, ultimately served everyone's interests better than taking easy shortcuts. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind, "Protect that, and you protect everything." James had done exactly that, and in doing so, he had discovered that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to say no. 6 months after the successful rescheduled ceremony, Captain James Whitmore found himself facing an entirely different kind of challenge. His reputation as someone willing to stand up for constitutional principles had spread far beyond the palace walls, and not everyone appreciated his newfound influence. The morning started like any other, with James conducting his regular inspection of the guard posts. The autumn air was crisp, and the palace grounds were painted in shades of gold and red. He had just finished reviewing the security arrangements for the upcoming state visit when his radio crackled to life. "Captain Whitmore to the Colonel's office immediately," came the voice of Richardson's aide. James frowned. Relations with Richardson had been professionally cordial since the ceremony incident, but there was always an underlying tension. The Colonel had never forgiven him for what he saw as public humiliation, despite the fact that the Queen herself had praised James's actions. Walking through the palace corridors, James noticed an unusual number of black sedans parked in the forecourt. Important visitors, but not ones he had been briefed about. His security instincts immediately sharpened. In Richardson's office, James found not just the Colonel, but also 2 men in expensive suits, who didn't introduce themselves. Their bearing and the way they positioned themselves suggested government officials, likely from one of the intelligence services. "Captain Whitmore," Richardson began, his voice unusually formal, "these gentlemen have some questions about your recent activities." The older of the 2 visitors, a thin man with steel-gray hair, leaned forward. "Captain, We understand you've been conducting private research into various palace protocols and procedures. James kept his expression neutral. I regularly review security and ceremonial procedures as part of my duties, sir. We're talking about research that goes beyond your official responsibilities, the man continued. Research that involves constitutional law, historical precedents, and communications with outside legal experts. If you're referring to the matter of the ceremonial title, that was resolved months ago with full approval from both the Queen and Parliament. The second visitor, younger and more aggressive, spoke up. We're concerned about your pattern of behavior, Captain. First the title issue, then request for palace legal documents, consultations with university professors, and now we understand you've been asking questions about other royal prerogatives. James felt a chill. They had been watching him far more closely than he had realized. I take my oath to protect the crown seriously. That includes ensuring we operate within proper legal boundaries. Richardson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Captain, perhaps you could explain why you've been researching the legal basis for various royal pardons granted in the past 5 years. This was news to James. He had made no such research. I haven't been investigating royal pardons, sir. The older visitor pulled out a thick file. We have records of your computer accessing the Royal Clemency database 17 times in the past month. We also have reports of you meeting with Professor Helen Morrison from the London School of Economics. James's mind raced. Someone was either lying or there had been a serious misunderstanding. I have never accessed any clemency database and I don't know anyone named Helen Morrison. Are you saying these computer logs are fabricated? The younger man asked aggressively. I'm saying I didn't make those searches. If my access credentials were used, then either someone else is using them or there's been a mistake. Richardson looked genuinely puzzled now. Captain, these are serious allegations. If someone has compromised your security clearance, we need to know immediately. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If James wasn't responsible for the database searches, then someone else with access to his credentials was conducting unauthorized research into sensitive royal matters. James pulled out his notebook and pen. I want to go through every one of these alleged activities. If someone is impersonating me or using my access fraudulently, we need to identify them. Over the next 2 hours, they reviewed each suspicious activity in detail. James was able to provide alibis for most of the times when the database searches had occurred. He had been on duty in public areas of the palace where his movements were recorded by security cameras. The breakthrough came when the older visitor, who finally introduced himself as Director Matthews from the Cabinet Office, showed James a photograph from one of his alleged meetings with Professor Morrison. This was taken outside the British Library last Tuesday, Matthews said. James studied the image carefully. It showed a man in a Royal Guard uniform speaking with a middle-aged woman near the library entrance. The man's face was partially obscured by the angle of the photograph, but something about his posture looked familiar. That's not me, James said firmly, but I think I know who it is. Richardson leaned forward. Who? The build, the way he stands, the fact that he has access to a dress uniform. I believe that's Sergeant Marcus Cole. Matthews and his colleague exchanged glances. Cole was a 15-year veteran of the Royal Guard, known for his ambition and his frustration at being passed over for promotion. He had applied for James's position 3 times and had been openly resentful when James received commendations for the title ceremony incident. Cole would have known about my research into constitutional matters, James continued. He was present during several briefings where it was discussed. He could have decided to conduct his own investigation, perhaps hoping to find something that would discredit me. Richardson was already reaching for his phone. I want Cole in my office within the hour. While they waited, Matthews explained the broader concerns that had prompted their investigation. Captain, We're not trying to discourage legitimate oversight, but there have been some sensitive matters recently where unauthorized disclosure could cause significant diplomatic problems. James nodded. I understand, sir. But I hope you also understand that my commitment to constitutional compliance isn't something I can or will abandon. Actually, Matthews said, that's why this investigation was so important. We needed to know whether your activities represented a security risk or a valuable asset. Based on what we've learned today, I'm leaning toward the latter. When Cole arrived, his confident demeanor quickly crumbled under questioning. Faced with the evidence and the threat of serious charges, he admitted to using James's computer access while James was on duty elsewhere. He had hoped to find evidence that James had overlooked some constitutional violation, something that would expose him as incompetent or hypocritical. I thought if I could prove he was wrong about something, people would stop treating him like some kind of hero, Cole confessed. The royal pardon thing was just a guess. I figured if there were problems there, it would be a big scandal. Richardson's face was grim. Sergeant Cole, you've committed serious breaches of security protocols and violated your oath of service. You're suspended pending a full disciplinary hearing. After Cole was escorted away, Matthews turned to James. Captain, this incident has actually highlighted something important. Your approach to constitutional oversight is exactly what the Crown needs, but it should be formalized. What do you mean? The Queen has been discussing the creation of a new position, a constitutional compliance officer who would work directly with the palace legal team to ensure all royal activities meet proper legal standards. Your name has been mentioned prominently for the role. James felt a mixture of honor and apprehension. That would be quite a change from my current duties. You would retain your rank and ceremonial responsibilities, but you'd also have the authority and resources to conduct proper constitutional review. No more working alone or relying on informal consultations. Richardson, who had been quiet during this exchange, finally spoke up. Captain, I owe you an apology. I've been so focused on avoiding problems that I forgot our real job is to prevent them. What you did with the ceremony was exactly right, and I should have supported you from the beginning. That afternoon, James met with Sir Thomas Blackwood and Mrs. Pemberton to discuss the proposed new role. The office would be small but well-resourced, with access to legal databases, constitutional experts, and historical archives. The key, Sir Thomas explained, is that you would have the authority to raise concerns directly with the Queen if necessary, bypassing the normal chain of command when constitutional issues are at stake. Mrs. Pemberton added, You'd also work with Parliament's Constitutional Committee to ensure we're always operating within the latest legal interpretations. As James walked home that evening, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. What had started as a simple decision to speak up about a questionable ceremony had evolved into a complete restructuring of how the palace approached constitutional compliance. Sarah noticed his thoughtful mood over dinner. Penny, for your thoughts? James smiled at his wife. Just thinking about how one honest action can lead to unexpected places. Are you regretting it? Not for a second. It's just fascinating how doing the right thing for the right reasons can open doors you never knew existed. Their conversation was interrupted by a call from Mrs. Pemberton. Captain, the Queen would like to see you tomorrow morning. She's made her decision about the constitutional compliance officer position. The next morning, James found himself once again in the Queen's private study. This time, she was joined by Sir Thomas and a man James didn't recognize. Captain Whitmore, the Queen began, I'd like you to meet Lord Chancellor Pemberton. He chairs Parliament's Constitutional Committee. The Lord Chancellor stood to shake James's hand. Captain, your reputation precedes you. Parliament is very interested in this new liaison position. The Queen continued. We've decided to create the Constitutional Compliance Office, and I'm offering you the position of director. You would report jointly to me and to the Lord Chancellor. ensuring that both the Crown and Parliament are satisfied with our constitutional oversight. James felt the weight of the moment. Your Majesty, I'm honored by the offer, but I want to ensure I understand the responsibilities fully. You would review all significant royal decisions before they're implemented, maintain liaison with constitutional scholars and legal experts, and provide regular reports to both the palace and Parliament on our compliance status. Sir Thomas added, you'd also have the authority to delay or suspend any royal action if you identify constitutional concerns, pending proper legal review. It was an extraordinary level of responsibility and authority. James would essentially become the guardian of the monarchy's constitutional legitimacy. There is one condition, the Queen said, her expression becoming serious. This role requires absolute integrity and independence. You cannot be influenced by politics, personal relationships, or pressure from any source. Can you commit to that level of independence? James thought of his grandfather's words about protecting the institution above all else. Your Majesty, I can make that commitment. Then welcome to your new position, Director Whitmore. The announcement of James's appointment was met with widespread approval from constitutional experts, members of Parliament, and the media. The creation of the Constitutional Compliance Office was seen as a progressive step that strengthened the monarchy by ensuring its adherence to legal principles. But James also knew that his new role would bring new challenges. There would be people who would try to influence his decisions, others who would resent his authority, and situations where doing the right thing would be even more difficult than before. His first major test came sooner than expected. Within a week of taking the position, he discovered that a proposed royal visit to a foreign country might violate international law due to ongoing legal disputes about territorial sovereignty. The visit had been planned for months and involved complex diplomatic negotiations. This time, however, James wasn't alone. He had a team of legal experts, direct access to the Queen, and the backing of Parliament. When he raised his concerns, they were taken seriously from the start. The visit was redesigned to avoid the legal complications, and the foreign government actually expressed appreciation for the Crown's attention to legal details. What could have been a diplomatic disaster became an example of the monarchy's commitment to international law. Sitting in his new office at the end of his first month as director, James looked at the mountain of cases waiting for review. Each one represented a potential constitutional issue that needed careful examination. It was daunting, but it was also exactly what he had sworn to do when he first put on the uniform of the Royal Guard. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Sarah. "How was your first month as the palace's constitutional watchdog?" she asked. James laughed. "Challenging, rewarding, and just a little bit terrifying." "Any regrets about speaking up at that ceremony?" "None at all. It turns out that standing up for what's right has a way of leading to even more opportunities to do the right thing." As he prepared to leave for the evening, James realized that his story was far from over. He had found his true calling. But he had also discovered that protecting constitutional principles was not a one-time act of courage. It was a daily commitment that would require constant vigilance, unwavering integrity, and the continued support of those who valued the rule of law above convenience or tradition. 2 years into his role as Director of Constitutional Compliance, James Whitmore faced the most complex challenge of his career. A crisis was brewing that would test every principle he had fought to establish and force him to make decisions that could reshape the monarchy itself. The trouble began with what seemed like a routine review of royal charitable foundations. James had been conducting a systematic audit of all Crown-related organizations to ensure they operated within proper legal frameworks. Most of the foundations were models of transparency and compliance, but one organization stood out for all the wrong reasons. The Royal Heritage Preservation Trust had been established 30 years earlier, with noble goals of protecting historic sites and artifacts. However, as James dug deeper into its operations, He discovered a web of questionable financial arrangements, political connections, and potential conflicts of interest that reached into the highest levels of government. The Trust's board included several members of Parliament, former cabinet ministers, and business leaders with significant government contracts. More troubling, the Trust had received substantial funding from foreign sources, including governments with questionable human rights records. James's investigation revealed that the Trust had been used as an unofficial diplomatic channel, facilitating meetings and agreements that bypassed normal governmental oversight. Some of these arrangements appeared to involve commitments made on behalf of the Crown without proper constitutional authority. The complexity of the situation became clear when James discovered that Prince Edward, the Queen's youngest brother, served as the Trust's royal patron and had been personally involved in several of the questionable arrangements. This wasn't just a matter of administrative oversight. It potentially involved a senior member of the royal family in activities that violated constitutional principles. James knew he needed expert help. He assembled a small team of investigators, including financial analysts, constitutional lawyers, and experts in international law. Working in secrecy to avoid premature publicity, they spent months uncovering the full scope of the Trust's activities. The evidence they gathered was damning. The Trust had essentially operated as a shadow foreign ministry, making commitments and agreements that should have been handled through official diplomatic channels. Foreign governments had paid substantial sums to the Trust in exchange for access to royal family members and unofficial assurances about British policy. Most seriously, they found evidence that the Trust had promised royal support for several controversial international projects without consulting the Foreign Office or obtaining proper governmental approval. These commitments potentially bound the Crown to positions that conflicted with official British foreign policy. James faced an agonizing decision. Exposing the Trust's activities would create a massive scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation and potentially implicate Prince Edward in serious legal violations. But ignoring the situation would mean allowing constitutional violations to continue and would compromise everything he had worked to establish. He decided to follow the protocol he had established for serious constitutional concerns, requesting a private meeting with the Queen to present his findings before taking any other action. The meeting took place on a gray March morning in the Queen's private study. James had prepared a comprehensive report, but he could see from Camilla's expression that she was already aware something serious was brewing. "Director Whitmore," she began, "I understand you have concerns about the Royal Heritage Preservation Trust." James was surprised. "Your Majesty, how did you know?" "Prince Edward came to see me yesterday. He's been receiving pressure from several quarters about the Trust's activities, and he's concerned that a public scandal is imminent." "Your Majesty, my investigation has revealed serious constitutional violations. The Trust has been operating outside proper legal authority, and some of its commitments may have compromised the Crown's constitutional position." The Queen listened carefully as James presented his evidence. Her expression grew increasingly grave as the extent of the problems became clear. "How bad is this, Director?" she asked when he finished. "Your Majesty, it's potentially devastating. If these activities became public without proper handling, they could trigger a constitutional crisis. Parliament would almost certainly demand a full investigation, and there could be calls for significant restrictions on royal prerogatives." The Queen was quiet for several minutes, studying the documents James had provided. Finally, she looked up. "Director Whitmore, what would you recommend?" James had anticipated this question and had spent sleepless nights considering the options. "Your Majesty, I believe we need to take immediate action to stop the Trust's questionable activities, conduct a full internal audit, and voluntarily disclose our findings to Parliament before they're discovered through other means. That would mean publicly admitting that the Crown has been involved in constitutional violations." "Yes, Your Majesty. But it would also demonstrate our commitment to correcting those violations and preventing future ones. The alternative is risking a much larger scandal if these activities are exposed by external investigations. The Queen stood and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens where early spring flowers were beginning to bloom. "Director, do you realize what you're asking me to do?" "Your Majesty, I'm asking you to do what you did with the ceremonial title issue 2 years ago. Choose constitutional integrity over convenience, even when it's difficult." She turned back to face him. "The difference is that this situation involves my family directly. Prince Edward isn't just the trust's patron, he's my brother." James felt the weight of the moment. "Your Majesty, that makes it even more important that we handle this properly. The Crown's credibility depends on its willingness to hold all its members accountable to the same legal standards." The Queen returned to her desk and picked up the phone. "Mrs. Pemberton, please arrange for Prince Edward to join us immediately. Also, ask Sir Thomas to come as soon as possible." When Prince Edward arrived 20 minutes later, his usual confident demeanor was noticeably absent. He looked like a man carrying a heavy burden, and James realized that the prince was probably more aware of the trust's problems than anyone had suspected. "Edward," the Queen began, "Director Whitmore has briefed me on his investigation into the Royal Heritage Preservation Trust. I need you to tell me everything about your involvement with the organization." For the next hour, Prince Edward provided a detailed account of how he had become involved with the trust and how its activities had gradually evolved from legitimate cultural preservation to quasi-diplomatic operations. He admitted that he had been uncomfortable with many of the trust's recent activities, but had been assured by board members that everything was legal and proper. "I realize now that I should have questioned those assurances more carefully," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I never intended to compromise the Crown's constitutional position, but I can see that my involvement has done exactly that." Sir Thomas arrived during the prince's confession and listened with growing alarm as the situation was explained. When the briefing concluded, his assessment was blunt. "This is a constitutional crisis waiting to happen," he said. "If these activities become public without proper handling, Parliament will almost certainly demand significant restrictions on royal activities and possibly the removal of Prince Edward from the line of succession." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. James realized that his investigation had uncovered not just administrative problems, but a situation that could fundamentally alter the structure of the monarchy. The Queen finally spoke. "What are our options, Sir Thomas?" "We have 3 choices, Your Majesty. We can try to contain the situation quietly and hope it doesn't become public. We can wait for external investigations to expose the problems and then respond defensively. Or we can take immediate proactive action to address the violations and voluntarily disclose them to Parliament." "What would proactive action involve?" James answered. "Immediate suspension of all questionable trust activities, a complete audit of its operations, cooperation with any governmental investigations, and most importantly, demonstration that the Crown takes constitutional compliance seriously enough to hold its own members accountable." Prince Edward looked up. "Are you saying I should resign from all my royal duties?" "Sir, I'm saying that the Crown's credibility requires visible accountability. The specific consequences would be determined by the Queen and Parliament, but there must be clear acknowledgement that constitutional violations have serious results." The Queen studied her brother's face. "Edward, what do you think is the right course of action?" The prince was quiet for a long moment. "Camilla, I think Director Whitmore is right. We've built our modern reputation on being a constitutional monarchy that operates within the law. I can't be an exception to that principle, especially when my actions have compromised the institution we're supposed to protect." Over the following week, a series of extraordinary meetings took place. The Queen consulted with the Prime Minister, who was initially shocked by the revelations, but ultimately supported the Crown's proactive approach. Parliament's Constitutional Committee was briefed in confidence and agreed to work with the palace on a response that would address the violations while preserving constitutional stability. The most difficult conversation was between James and his own family. Sarah could see that he was under enormous stress, and their teenage children had begun asking questions about why their father seemed so preoccupied. "I can't discuss the details," James told his family over dinner one evening, "but I want you to know that we may face some difficult publicity in the coming weeks. The decisions I've had to make in my job have led to some very serious consequences." His daughter, now 16 and politically aware, looked at him with concern. "Dad, are you in trouble?" "No, sweetheart, but sometimes doing the right thing means accepting that there will be uncomfortable consequences. I need you and your brother to understand that no matter what you might read in the newspapers, I'm proud of the work I've done." The public disclosure came 3 weeks later. The palace issued a comprehensive statement acknowledging the constitutional problems with the Royal Heritage Preservation Trust and announcing immediate corrective actions. Prince Edward voluntarily suspended his royal duties pending a full investigation and expressed his commitment to cooperating with any governmental inquiries. The media response was intense, but largely positive. Constitutional experts praised the Crown's proactive approach, and editorial writers noted the contrast with historical royal scandals where the palace had tried to minimize or hide problems. James found himself once again in the spotlight, this time as the man who had exposed constitutional violations within the royal family itself. Some critics accused him of being overzealous or disloyal, but the overwhelming response was supportive. The parliamentary investigation that followed was thorough but fair. The committee concluded that while serious constitutional violations had occurred, the Crown's voluntary disclosure and corrective actions demonstrated genuine commitment to constitutional compliance. Prince Edward's suspension was made permanent by mutual agreement, and new protocols were established for all royal charitable activities. The Royal Heritage Preservation Trust was dissolved, with its legitimate assets transferred to organizations with proper oversight. 6 months after the crisis began, James was summoned to another private meeting with the Queen. This time, the atmosphere was very different. The stress and uncertainty had been replaced by a sense of resolution and renewed purpose. "Director Whitmore," the Queen began, "I want to thank you for your courage during these difficult months. I know it wasn't easy to pursue an investigation that ultimately implicated my family." James felt the weight of the experience. "Your Majesty, it was the most difficult decision I've ever had to make, but I believe it was necessary to preserve the integrity of the constitutional compliance system we've worked to establish." "The system worked exactly as it should have," the Queen agreed. "We identified problems, addressed them honestly, and demonstrated that constitutional principles apply to everyone, including the royal family." She paused, then continued. "James, I have one more request. Parliament and the Prime Minister have asked that you consider expanding your role. They want to establish a constitutional compliance authority that would oversee not just royal activities, but all constitutional matters involving the Crown, Parliament, and the judiciary." It was an extraordinary proposal. James would essentially become Britain's chief constitutional watchdog, with authority to investigate and address constitutional violations across all branches of government. "It would be a massive responsibility," the Queen continued, "but you've proven that you have the integrity and courage to handle difficult constitutional issues fairly and effectively." James thought about his grandfather's words about protecting the institution. The new role would allow him to protect not just the monarchy, but the entire constitutional system that underpinned British democracy. "Your Majesty, I accept the responsibility, but only with the understanding that the authority must be completely independent." I cannot serve the Crown's interests if I'm seen as the Crown's employee. Agreed completely. The authority would be established by Parliament and would report to both the Crown and Parliament equally. As James left the palace that day, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. What had started with a simple decision to speak up about a questionable ceremony had evolved into a fundamental restructuring of how Britain approached constitutional compliance. The establishment of the Constitutional Compliance Authority was announced 6 months later to widespread acclaim. Legal experts called it a revolutionary step that would strengthen British democracy by ensuring that all government actions adhered to constitutional principles. On his first day in his new role as Chief Constitutional Compliance Officer, James sat in his expanded offices overlooking the Thames. His staff now included constitutional lawyers, investigators, and liaison officers who worked with every branch of government. Sarah joined him for lunch that first day, bringing sandwiches to his new office. "So, how does it feel to be Britain's constitutional conscience?" she asked with a smile. James laughed. "Terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. I never imagined that refusing to participate in one questionable ceremony would lead to all this. Are you happy with how things turned out?" James looked out at the Thames, where centuries of British history had flowed past these windows. "I'm proud that we've created a system that puts constitutional principles above personal or political convenience. But I also know that this is just the beginning. Protecting constitutional democracy is a daily responsibility, not a one-time achievement." His phone rang, interrupting their conversation. It was his deputy reporting a potential constitutional issue with a proposed government regulation. James sighed, smiled at his wife, and reached for the phone. "Chief Compliance Officer Whitmore," he answered. "How can I help ensure we're doing this properly?" As he began reviewing the new case, James realized that his story would continue for as long as British democracy needed guardians willing to speak truth to power. The boy who had dreamed of serving the Crown had grown into a man whose service protected the constitutional principles that made the Crown worth serving. His grandfather had been right. Protecting the institution meant protecting the law and the promise made to the people. James had found his life's work in that protection, and he knew that no matter how challenging the future cases might be, he would face them with the same courage and integrity that had brought him this far. The Crown, Parliament, and the people of Britain were stronger because someone had been willing to say that legitimacy mattered more than convenience, that constitutional principles mattered more than personal comfort, and that doing the right thing was always worth the risk. In his desk drawer, James kept a copy of his original oath as a royal guard, along with a letter from the Queen thanking him for his service during the trust crisis. Below them was a photo of his grandfather in his royal guard uniform, a reminder of the legacy of service that had guided James through every difficult decision. As evening fell over London, James prepared to head home to his family, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to protect the constitutional democracy he had sworn to serve. His transformation from a ceremonial guard to Britain's chief constitutional officer was complete, but his work was just beginning.